Great Wednesday, and welcome to the Fully Human Connections podcast. I'm your host King, and today I'm joined again by my co-host Reggie. How you doing today, Reggie?
I'm doing really well, King. It's hit the winter solstice and the days are going to start getting longer now, although very slowly. But yeah, I'm in a good place. I can't complain. How about you?
Doing great, doing
Yeah,
great. Actually, this is supposed to be the shortest day of the year, right? As far as sunshine is concerned.
yeah,
Then
and
it
then it
starts
gets
to then it starts to increase.
uh,
Yeah. Well, that's what a lot of people say about Christmas. That it's the based on the winter solstice. It's the 25th is when the sun starts to be reborn
yeah,
and starts to get older, and that's where a lot of the uh, Christmas around Jesus being born on 25th. But if we wanted to go there, but I tell you, getting started. The gratitude moment today is I'm grateful for again, the typical life, health, ability to see, hear, walk, talk, stand, breathe, and have a sound mind. For another 24 hours, pursue my purpose in life. Definitely heat. That's because as cold as it is out here, as well as a mother who's alive. Like I said, getting a chance to spend time with my mother at this relationship is different, and you can learn to cherish and appreciate that without longing for what it used to be. Grateful for you for the age you helped me with this week. Definitely appreciate it. And just grateful for infinite possibilities that this day and this week and coming year will provide.
yeah, yeah. Great. So, thank you for that. And I remain grateful for, especially but not only this time of year, indoor plumbing, heat, a refrigerator with mostly fresh food, and then a stove with which I can cook and really conveniently just prepare good food without having to work too hard. And it's again, I'm aware that that puts me in an exclusive club on this planet. There are billions of people that don't have that access. Um, and into my own health and for this conversation too, I'm grateful because I think I won't project it onto you, but I know our conversation reminds me of all of the things I have to be grateful for. I mean, we talk about a variety of different things on the podcast, but we always begin with this gratefulness moment. And at my best, I remember that every day. And on those days when I'm maybe a little bit forgetful, this is a great reminder for me. So I'm grateful for the reminder as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I've realized, again, I'm a person that definitely firmly believes and lives that energy is everything and everything is energy. And when you get into the creating the energy of gratitude, that you start to see it in everything and you read it in books. It's funny. I got a recommendation from a book from Amazon, a book called Leading with Gratitude. Read that book, and as you see, it's 10 Commandments of Spiritual Capitalism,
Mhm.
Count Your Blessings. So I really like that context of just seeing gratitude being spoken or written in the books that I'm reading or mentioned in conversations that I'm having with individuals, because it just shows me that those people are people I want in my tribe, and people who I have things in alignment with. And like I said, I can't really stress enough the difference between alignment and in the common, and how going down the road of always looking for things to have in common with people that I found is the wrong road to go down. Even romantic relationships. I've dated people and they're like, you got so much in common with this person. And it might be true. We might like the same music, we might be the same age, come from the same, culture. But then when it come down to things about alignment, which is much more intrinsic, such as,
Yeah.
which principles you focus on, what's your growth mindset, how do you feel about, how do you view life in general? That's where you differ. And that difference is what prevents the relationship, whether it's romantic, whether it's business, whether it's just a acquaintance, from really growing more because of the significance of what alignment can do versus just having something in common.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate you pointing that out because when you use those two words, being aligned and having something in common. When I first heard you refer to that, that's how I heard it, that the something in common, could be some intrinsic things, but it's mostly external things we share and agree on and have maybe from our past. But alignment is that intrinsic piece. And ultimately, that's the most important thing. So, I mean, I think as we continue to get to know each other, I think it's been about a half a year now. And what keeps us coming back, or what drew us together, I think, was, a certain alignment. And we don't agree on every single thing. And our backgrounds, or, childhoods and upbringings are different. But we seem to be fairly well aligned. And when we do have a difference of opinion, that's all it is. That's okay. We differ or we disagree. So but I feel that alignment with you as well.
And that's where our exploration of becoming more fully human with every conversation, and that's one of the things we advocate.
Yeah.
And I think it's an excellent segue into you setting the context for our discussion today. We're going to continue to build from your book. So why don't you lead us into that discussion, please?
Yeah, so we're talking about Healing America's Narratives, a book that came out in October of this year, just going on 3 months ago. It looks like this. The subtitle of it is The Feminine, the Masculine, and Our Collective National Shadow. And we've been speaking about various aspects of the book really since June, pretty much once a week. We've missed a couple. And today we're going to something that we haven't really addressed fully, but there's a chapter in the book, towards the end of the book, chapter 10, that makes the case for one individual, and we'll mention his name in just a couple of minutes, who embodies, in my view, all of the elements of the collective national shadow. And specifically, just to review what we mean by the elements of shadow, is those pieces. It could be of an individual, of an organization, in this case, of a nation, of the United States, that we deny or don't know are there. And so for the shadow of the United States, we're speaking about 9 particular elements. And again, these are my 9. Somebody else might identify some others or say there are more or fewer. These are the ones that I build my case around. So the 9 elements of the shadow are ignorance, arrogance, bigotry, fear, violence, greed, excess, bullying, and untrustworthiness. I'm actually really proud because when we first began having these conversations, I could never get all 9 of them out.
Yeah, I saw you go right through that list. Impressive. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have a good order now in terms of not really causation, but a logical order. So once I have something to remember them, like a mnemonic device, I can remember them. It was easier. So to the point, it's not a major part of the book, but it makes it easy to point to examples that the 45th president of the United States, Donald Trump, if you look at his trajectory, not just during his presidency and post-presidency, but throughout his life, I make the argument, and I back it up with specific checkable evidence. So you can, if somebody thinks I'm making things up, they can go check my sources or just read the news, that he embodies all of those: ignorance, arrogance, bigotry, fear, violence, greed, excess, bullying, and untrustworthiness. And again, even though there's a chapter based on that, the essence of the book is not about him at all, but it's about half of the voting public, just, less than half the voting public. That's how come he lost in 2020. But, some 70 plus million Americans still thought he'd be a good guy to have a second term as president, despite of this ignorance, arrogance, greed, etc. And that's the concern that I have that led me to write the book and to speak about this, because there's a lot of denial, in my estimation. Well, it's either denial or it's an intentional decision to continue down a road that is greedy, excessive, violent, bigoted, and fearful. Um, and so, like, I'm hoping it's denial and that it's shadow, and it's not people intentionally choosing those 9 traits, because that would be both of those are a problem. If people are intentionally choosing ignorance, arrogance, fear, and violence and untrustworthiness, we have a really major issue in this country. So anyway, that's the setting for what we're going to uh, dance with today.
Well, I think that's an excellent and timely discussion to have. You know, my initial comments about that is this, and it's interesting. The more I began to grow spiritually and tap into my fully human connection mindset of seeing myself as a human being and not the label or a tribe that I was forced into by society. Like I said, you know, going through the different phases. I liken it to what Carl Jung talks about when you go through from the, you know, the warrior, the athlete, to the warrior, to the statesman, and to the, you know, the spirit. There's 4 different maturity gradual levels you go through. I say the same thing with myself. Growing up as you grow up as a male as your dominant, you know, that's your gender, and then you go from male to boy, and then that's a certain maturity level. Then you go from boy to man, and then from man my identity becomes my race, and then from there your career and so on and so forth. That once you supersede that and you stop identifying yourself even by your name and your gender and your race, and you tap into the human part of it, you begin to see and hear things from all different perspectives. And where I'm going with this is, like, for example, I can now understand, don't agree with, but understand where Trump's base of folks identify and connect with him and possibly see things they have in common with him because they feel he speaks to what they're saying. And they can, and when you have something that you feel that you're really in common with somebody, then you will willing to, I would say, dumb down or not emphasize or not consider the other rhetoric they're saying or the other bad characteristics they may be portraying. So, like everyone else who doesn't agree with Trump can easily point out all his issues, right? And the folks who are not necessarily may like some of the policies he stood for can then justify his other behaviors and say, well, yeah, no one's perfect. And then look at other politicians and say, well, they've also shown some of those same behavior characteristics you talked about as well. Maybe Trump may be a little more extreme, but if he brings this particular policy out, then I can tolerate that. And I liken that to, for example, how my community, when I say my community, I'm saying the community of Black individuals, I still hear justify and tolerate Kanye or Ye's comments.
Yeah.
Like, to me, he's crossed that line. You know, he crossed the line long ago, but people kept tolerating him and, you know, calling him a genius because he brought some value to the world in people's eyes. But now he's going down that slippery slope and he's in alignment with, as you say, the 45th president. And I'm just thinking, like, I watched him on Alex Jones. Well, I didn't really watch Alex Jones, but so many people who I do watch replayed the podcast interview with Alex Jones, and for him to be on there and say the things about, like, he doubled down, he tripled down, you know, made an emphasis to say he loved Hitler and he loved Nazis, and he's sitting there with a known white supremacist. And see, where I'm going with this, I've talked to several other Black people, and, you know, I've told you recently, the last 3 weeks, I attended a serious discussion on Blacks and Jews.
Yeah.
And where I'm going with this is, my point is this, that if we're going to get to the point where we can really try to come together as a group, which I don't think we can if we see ourselves as groups, I think we have to see each other as individuals first, and then we can build from there. But if we're going to come at the group dynamic, then we as a people, Black people, must put out there and condemn Kanye for his statements. Because if we don't do that, then we try to justify to say, oh yeah, He did go over a little bit, but we don't condemn him like he should be condemned. Anytime you say you love Hitler, right? Even though Hitler wouldn't have loved him, that's the ironic part. Hitler was, if he studied history and knew anything about history, Hitler would have put him in an oven just as quickly as he put the Jews in the oven, because he was about the master right race. So there would have been no love for Kanye at all. But where I'm going with this is the same thing with Trump, is that we got to get to the point, if we're really going to begin to connect and build with each other, we have to first understand what the other person sees in that person. Don't dismiss them just outright, but then begin to point out to say, well, can you at least agree that this is wrong? And then begin to chisel away at each little chink in the armor. Then I think hopefully from that kind of back and forth discussion, if a person is really open to exploring how we can become more fully human, you can begin to now understand, as Stephen R. Covey talks about, seek first to understand. You can begin to understand where the other person's coming from, and then hopefully some common ground can be established throughout the conversation. I know I said a lot there, but
yeah.
I just want to draw the parallels because that's what I see. I see that parallel for the folks who triumph and tolerate and always continue to accept things from the 45th president. I see the same thing happening with Kanye, where people will tolerate that narcissistic, selfish, fear-baiting things that you talk about if it fits their agenda.
Yeah, no, I appreciate and I love that you ended or concluded with the Covey quote, seek first to understand and then to be understood. One of the clearest voices I really learned a lot from in the last several years is the University of Chicago, excuse me, a historian who specializes in extremist groups in America. So her name is Catherine or Kathleen, I forget. Apologies if she ever sees this. And her last name is Belew, Belew. And she spoke about specifically about the groups who were part of the January 6th insurrection. In other words, it wasn't all one group. There were a lot of different groups in there. And just, on a superficial level, briefly from my memory, the most dangerous group was a group that really began post the Vietnam War. And it was a group, many of whom were veterans. And again, they're not all Vietnam War veterans, but who really don't like the federal government. And they, are pretty much white, nationalist groups, and they're kind of anti-federal government. And, they're characterized by people, like the guys that came in with all the camera, the Kevlar vests and the weapons and who were really prepared to go to battle. Then there were some at the opposite extreme. There were some folks in the middle, but the opposite extreme were just some, and you can see it's just some people kind of in the back of the group who never really made it into the Capitol, who had trusted Donald Trump, who back when he ran for office, he said that probably the one true thing he said when he was campaigning was that the system is broken, that he's an outsider, he's not part. So up to that point, those two things are true. And then he said, only I can fix it. And he had he didn't know what was in the Constitution. He's never read any sacred scripture that there's any evidence of. So he had no, and he kind of thought he was comparing one of his father's companies and his own companies to a country. And those are not the same thing, a for-profit organization and running a nation. So he got that part wrong because he didn't know how to fix anything except to bully people. So there were some folks in the back who they were following what the president said. Come to Washington, D.C. on January 6th, and we'll stop this steal. And when he said that the election had been stolen. Then there were some other groups in the middle, and I don't have a solid enough memory of all of who they were. But it wasn't like this one group of people who agreed on everything. Some were rather naive. Some were using Donald Trump to further their own agendas. That's the Proud Boys and others like them. And that was all possible One of the reasons that was all possible, because for the last 60 years, historically, when citizens and the government of the United States, with the best of intentions, fought for equal rights for everyone. And, going back as far as, the late 50s, early 60s with the Civil Rights Act in 64 and the Voting Rights Act in 65. And then right up to the present day with diversity, equity, and inclusion seminars and programs brought into government agencies and schools and corporations. What was done was often done, this is the best word I can come up with, unskillfully. In other words, what was being done was important, to really hold that 14th Amendment, equal protection of the laws for everyone, and so period. I'm not going to say regardless of blah, 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 for everyone. Everyone's a pretty clear word, right? And what some of the programs and right up again to the DEI stuff nowadays, they did it in a way that alienated other groups. And more specifically, it was lower middle income white folks who just got up every day, went to work, tried to take care of their kids and watch their jobs go overseas or watch their jobs get automated. And then they were told they were to blame for all the problems in the world. And when someone like Donald Trump came along and he said he could fix the system that was hurting them, they believed him. Now, they have some culpability there because there was nothing in his background to suggest that he could be a viable president of the United States. Most of them knew him as the host of the Celebrity Apprentice TV show. Most Americans, I grew up in Yonkers, New York, so I knew about him when he first appeared in the local New York newspapers when he was in his mid to late 20s, and he had just inherited all of his father's money and businesses. But he has as many failed and closed casinos and hotels as he's built. He just keeps on losing businesses. So, to that point, there's a certain arrogance because he knows that he lost the election, even though he continues to use that as a point to try to run again in 2024. The January 6th committee just this week began sharing their findings. It's really clear that he knew just what was going on and that his staff in the White House on January 6th pleaded with him to make an announcement to tell people to go home. He waited about 4 hours. He eventually did it around 6 p.m., I think, but all the damage was done by then. The vote count had been stopped. So, that people still trust and believe in him, for me, is the scariest piece. It's the most disturbing piece. He disturbs me, but that there are lots of people that still think it would be good to give him 4 more years is frightening. And just, one tidbit, and then I'll be quiet, just to make the case. So between Election Day in 2020, November 3rd, 2020, and Inauguration Day, which was January 21st, I believe, 2021. It might have been January 20th, 2021. In that time period, he was virtually invisible as a president, except to say that he had won and the election was stolen. He really didn't do much publicly on any other issues. I'm not saying he didn't do anything, but he didn't do a whole lot. And during that time period, from Election Day 2020 through inauguration of 2021, when Joe Biden was inaugurated, just under 15 million new cases of COVID surfaced in the U.S., and 185,000 plus Americans died from COVID. And he had stopped any kind of regular presidential announcements around the pandemic because he was angry that he lost. So he pretty much he was the epitome or the embodiment of a lame duck president. He didn't do much while people were dying. Now, there's a lot of other, things I could point to historically during his presidency. But that one alone, because a complete lack of compassion for the suffering of the country. And when he was asked by an NBC reporter, what would you say? And this was prior to Election Day. What would you say to Americans who are scared with this pandemic? And his response was, I would say that you're an awful human being for asking that question. You should be ashamed of yourself. America, and this is early in the pandemic, and people were dying and people were scared. And the reporter asked him, gave him a perfect opportunity. Picture that question being asked to Biden, Obama, even a guy that I'm not a big fan of, but George W. Bush. Picture any one of them being asked that question in the middle of a pandemic. None of them would have yelled at the reporter and stood with the reporter. So across the board, his unfitness for the presidency is pretty clear for people who can get, move beyond their political biases and wanting to, if you're a staunch Republican and you won't say anything bad about a Republican, then we're stuck. And same thing is true with Democrats who practice the same tactics. So I'll put a period at the end of that rather long rant. But the fear again is that some Americans still admire him for some reason.
Well, when you went through your list of the 9 elements of the shadow, I think that, I could be wrong, you've obviously done much more research. So I'd be curious to know what your answer is to this. But I would think that just from the discussion you pointed out, and then kind of looking at people's tolerance level and, as you say, admiration of the 45th president, I think fear might be the most powerful one, because you can stroke fear in people, particularly, and you can create alignment around victimness. If I can say, I understand you are a victim, and I understand that the world is coming at you. You've been attacked. Here's the enemies. Here's what the people are going to do to you. And I can stroke that fear and play along the victim, I call it frequency. That's a very powerful motivator to either get people to do action or to take non-action, which can almost be the same as action, depending on what the non-action may be. Yeah. And I think that's where he successfully taps into, and that people are still saying, well, no one else speaks to my victimness that I feel. Like you said, the white folks who are poor middle class that feel like they're not getting from their perspective, the benefits of being American that others are sharing. And then you hear the world say, well, there's white privilege. And they're saying, well, hell, I don't benefit from that. I'm still suffering. I don't get all the things that people claim that white people get. And then I've been told that there's white privilege. And then I'm also being held back from jobs or companies counseling or moving overseas. And I still don't get my full employment benefits. I still don't get, changing industries and all these things. So now I'm a victim and no one cares. There's no NAACP for those organizations, so there's no one lobbying for those organizations. So Trump comes out and says, I feel your pain. I connect with you. I'm going to do something for you. And to your point, no evidence has shown that he will do those things. He hasn't shown that he has any kind of integrity when it comes to standing up for his word, but his arrogance and his boldness and his persona was something that people really connected with. And it was, like I said, I know a lot of Black folks who connected to him as well. Like they loved his bravado. They loved his attitude of, being able to quickly shut down reporters and not play the system. Because I think that's where the Black folks who connected with him connected with his anti-system mentality. Yeah. Like, okay, he's speaking anti-system. I can connect with that because, the system has been very oppressive to us. And he's saying he's opposed to the system. So I like that because, first thing he did was tap into something that had already been said for years, but he really put it on the stage when he said fake news. He didn't create that statement, but people always, definitely within the communities and the conversations I had with folks didn't believe and didn't trust the media anyway. And then, but no one would say it to that extent and hold the media accountable to the media during press conferences at that level. And so when he came out and did it, it just brought a lot of people like, well, yeah, the news is fake. And but of course he was only referring to fake news that's related to news about him, not in general.
Yeah.
So, but I would give him credit for being a master at manipulation.
Okay.
Like he knows how to play the songs that get the victims to dance. Like if you tap into that victim frequency, he's going to play the songs that's going to tap into that better than anybody else. And I think he's really a case study to be studied in that. But I say all that to ask, so now with that context being said, do you believe that out of the 9 elements, that one element is more dominant or more powerful than the other elements, like a hierarchical structure, or given at any given time, any other 9 elements can be just as disastrous or damaging as the other 9?
Yeah, it's a great question. I love the way you frame that around fear too, and I agree that he created fear with a group of people. Again, not only the lower middle class white folks. He also put his arm around the wealthy Americans who related to him because he wanted lower taxes and he was purportedly a millionaire or billionaire. But to your point, fear is, I think of the 9 elements, fear is, I would agree, has the highest motivational quotient. Fear is a big motivator. In terms of it being the most important, I think it's context dependent. If you looked at the history of Native Americans, I'd say that the shadow element that was the biggest, those that were the biggest were violence and untrustworthiness, because the federal government just kept lying to Native Americans for, a century plus. And I think there's often, I think fear works best through ignorance. And I'll give you just one example of that in terms of Donald Trump and the African American community. So two things actually come up for me on that. I forget the gentleman's name. It's in the book, and I'm not going to go looking for it now. But there was a Republican, African American gentleman who attended various Trump rallies. He's from California, and Trump would actually would see him in the audience and refer to him as my African American. Now, just think about that phrase for a second. That's a bad move. No matter what follows the word "my," put another ethnicity or race in there, but that's just not a good move. And Trump got away with that. In fact, the gentleman he was referring to kind of laughed about it and kept showing up until after about a year or so of the Trump presidency. This gentleman left the Republican Party and ran for Congress. And I think it was the 1st congressional district in California, but don't quote me on that. I forget exactly, because he said basically he sees, Trump as basically, and the Republican Party as basically being a white person's president and a white person's party. So it went from my African American, Trump's words, to this guy who kind of laughed at it at the beginning and liked Trump, to his eventually leaving the Republican Party and running for office as an independent. He didn't win, and his platform wasn't. His website is still up, and it wasn't really too well done. I went and looked at it. So that's one example. The second example, there was a horrible attack in New York's Central Park. I'm going to say I think it was back in the 1980s. Could have been early 90s. A white woman, a jogger, was beaten. I think she was raped, and 5 young African American men were arrested and confessed under duress, convicted, and went to prison. And fast forward, I forget how many years now, the details of the case escape me, but they ended up not being guilty. I forget how
Right.
long they served, and they became known as the Central Park Five. There's a movie made about that now. But even after they were exonerated, Donald Trump took out a full-page ad in the New York Times. Effectively, I read it as a kind of a racist manifesto, but it was basically about safety and we needed punishment for the crimes in the city, and it was based on the Central Park Five, that even if they were freed, and exonerated, and the city ended up paying them millions of dollars for false arrest and coerced confessions, he was still banging that same drum around. He was effectively equating violent crime in the city with young African American men. So, and I'm sharing that because of this fear and ignorance connection. Anyone who thought that Donald Trump had their best interests in mind just had to do some research in terms of his real views about women, about African Americans, and about poor people. I mean, his history was really clear about those issues. He was on tape, and it was a CBS or NBC bus talking to Billy Bush and bragging about his sexual prowess and how because he was a celebrity, he could touch and kiss and fondle women because knew he could get away with it.
Right.
So that was 2 years before he got elected. Nobody cared. So so that's the ignorance piece from where I'm sitting, and it goes back to what you said earlier around the difference between having things in common and being aligned. So I vote based on the alignment of my worldview with the candidate. That's the only thing I vote on. A candidate can have a different position on a given issue, like one particular issue, than I wish, he had voted this way or she had voted that way. But if generally I feel my worldview is aligned with this candidate, that's how I will vote. There was nothing. I mean, I have in common, Donald Trump and I, grew up about the same distance from Midtown Manhattan. He was in Queens, I was in Yonkers. We're both white guys. We're born about 8 years apart. Right? I didn't inherit $11 million from my father. But there was never any alignment there. And so that coming back to, again, the point you made early on, we were speaking about gratitude and different things at the top of the podcast, that alignment of values and worldview, I think, is such an important trait for us as human beings to look into. And if we really look, when we're looking into and trying to learn more and get to the heart and the truth of the matter, that's the best antidote for ignorance. And the less ignorant we are, the less unnecessary fear we experience. When somebody literally puts a gun to one's head, okay, that's a real reason to be afraid. You're in the middle of a real hurricane and your house is vibrating. That's a reason to be afraid, or a tornado. You get a bad diagnosis from the doctor or some reason to be afraid. But some of the fear that Donald Trump, I would say, incited was for anyone who was willing to do a little work, was, I don't know if I would call it illegitimate fear or fake fear, or there was really nothing to be afraid of. There might have been some work to do, but there wasn't really anything immediately threatening me or someone else. So fear is definitely a powerful, probably could be the most powerful motivating of those 9 shadow traits. But I think in any given context, ignorance or arrogance, I mean, the $64 million question is, when Donald Trump lies out loud, how much of that is ignorance and how much of it is arrogance? I think there's been both in his lies, but I would not pretend to know which is which in any given moment. And I think there's also fear. He has an inherent fear of being a loser, of being seen as a loser. And losing in 2020 was his worst nightmare coming true, I believe. So I think there's, he projects fear out there because he himself is afraid I think he's afraid that someone's going to see him who he really is. And as you said, a master manipulator, a guy who has as many failed businesses as successful businesses, and the guy who couldn't back up what he said as president of the United States. I mean, in 2017, after he had said he was going to repeal the Affordable Care Act in the first 100 days of his administration. So well into 2017, he actually said publicly, as the president of the United States, so let me tell you, healthcare is a really complicated issue. Nobody knew how complicated it was. It's taken us some time to, they never had, the Republicans have never had it. I typically don't speak party to party. The Republicans have never had a plan to make sure that all Americans have access to affordable health care. They've never had one. 2 presidents have tried. Clinton, basically with the first lady trying it, and they got their asses whooped, when they tried that. And then Barack Obama pushed it through. They're the only 2 presidents who have ever really tried that. Donald Trump was just trying to, he had this thing about Obama. He would criticize anything Obama did. But he actually said out loud that nobody knew how complicated healthcare was. I knew, just based on my own experience. But in the last 3 years before I became eligible for Medicare, I didn't have health insurance because I couldn't afford it. And actually, I could have afforded it, but it would have been too much of a chunk of my annual income and would have put a lot of other things in danger. So I'm pretty healthy, and I gambled that if I just paid for an out-of-pocket visit to my doctor when I needed it, my physical exam, because I take pretty good care of myself, that would be a more affordable move than paying. The best deal available to me was over $900 a month.
Right.
And so for 3 years, so 9 times 12 is what, 100, basically $10,800, something like that, approximately, times 3 years. I saved like $30-something thousand over 3 years just in premiums. I didn't want to do that, but it was the right move when I did it. So I understood how complicated the system was. And there were a lot of people much worse off than I was, who really had to have healthcare coverage because of some pre-existing condition or not being that healthy or being much, much older. But there was, the only thing Donald Trump ever said that I think was true, this is an exaggeration, but was that the system is broken. I agree with that. To this day, it is. I mean, it's not a system that's working well. I don't care what side of the aisle somebody sits on. But he definitely wasn't the person to fix it. I mean, he proved that over 4 years. And he would say that he was unable to fix it because COVID hit. Had COVID not hit, had there not been a pandemic, he would have been a better president. Some people might believe that. He didn't do a particularly good job with the pandemic. So I don't know. Though I apologize. That was a little bit of a rant there.
No, I understand it. I think that, honestly, I've had several conversations with people about him. I never got the impression or the feeling that he was racist. Now, do I think that he did some things that were unfavorable to Black folks? Absolutely. But I don't think it was to the point where, again, when I look at a racist, I look at someone like a David Duke, who's clear, where he stands with his position. Like, he would never do anything that's going to be for the improvement, the advancement of anybody Black, right? Yeah. Whereas I think Trump is more of other attributes that better describe him as criminal, narcissist, selfish, as you said, greedy, going on the other 9 elements. Yeah. But I think, and that's what Trump potentially gets away with, because when people say things like he's racist, and then he doesn't show racist behavior all the time. Like you mentioned Central Park 5, right? And yeah, that was definitely, bigoted what he did. But then you look at the other end of it, those 5 kids were out in the park doing things called wilding.
Right.
So it wasn't like they were just totally innocent kids just happened to be walking home from school. They were out in the park committing crimes. Now they didn't commit that crime, obviously, and nor did they deserve what happened to them. But by the same token, you know, if I'm if the shoe was on the other foot, and I'm just saying that a black woman was raped in the same situation, same dynamics, I think that people will be less tolerant of five white guys. The black community would have been less tolerant of five white guys who went through the same thing. They would have felt like, well, they still were out there doing, some kind of crime, right? So I think people still tend to go in their tribes for a certain thing and not look at it from all fully human perspectives.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not justifying anything that the police did with their terrorist tactics and the forced, confessions, all that stuff. That's why I say the criminal justice system is corrupt. So I'm more of a person that looks at the system itself instead of the individual. But I think Trump definitely is someone who has successfully played on the system being the way it is, tapping to the fear, gives us narcissism, and I think he's more about his own agenda. I think, like, for example, if he had intelligent blacks around him that, really were able to really give him strategy, I think he could have done something different for blacks just for the votes. Not that he cared, not that he really wanted to make anything improvement, but if it ends justifies the means, he would have done it in order to stay in office or to get the black vote. But when you surround yourself with people like Anna Rosa and all the other folks that were around him, the black people, they were no one who had brought any kind of political strategy at all. So he didn't know how to really. And then the media is constantly condemning him, saying he's a racist. He's a racist. But you hear people like Mike Tyson, you hear other black celebrities who knew him prior to him becoming the president. No one ever said he was racist. No one ever thought that he was racist, other than that Central Park 5 incident. And then when you come talking about him and his father and the buildings and the way they treated affordable housing, I know several different black developers who do the exact same thing. Or, and it's not a color thing, it's a low income thing. It's a stigma people have for folks who are low income, and predominantly folks with low income and in the city is going to be black. So they're gonna bear the burden of that vitriol, that kind of discrimination. So anyway, I'm just saying that at the end of the day, I think that going back to what you talk about in the book, the male and the feminine dynamic, and then looking at the 9 elements, I think the thing we really want to be careful of is making sure that we really focus on the systems about how people use. And like I said, Donald Trump is someone who came along and played within that system so well, and he exploits it so much. And he's definitely a criminal. I'm not justifying any of his actions at all. I hope he gets convicted finally for what happened on January 6th. That to me was the most atrocious thing that he's done, and he needs to be held accountable to that more than anything else than he's done before. All the other lies and all the things he's weaseled his way out of. But to cause an insurrection on the Capitol, to me, is where everybody should have been like, that's the bridge too far. Yeah. Like, that's where I say about, I mentioned Kanye earlier. I think that when you really begin to see something that you say, okay, I'm aligned with this person here, and he is the only person that's speaking this way, but when they cross this bridge, that's too far. Yeah. And January 6th was that for Trump. And I think that if you really are going to become a person who's looking to become more fully human, and that's what we really advocate here, folks, is not really choosing Democrat, Republican, because we can bring up a Democratic person and point out some of the same similar elements. Now, they might not be as obvious as the way Trump was able to, as you talked about, show those 9 elements. But a Democratic person like, Biden was, prior, back when he was just a senator and passing the crime bill. That, to me, the impact it had on my community was far worse than what Trump has ever done. Yes, those 5 kids, but locking up, hundreds of thousands of black men through the crime bill was arguably worse. Now, I didn't vote for Trump, nor am I a Trump supporter. I just look at things from a fully human context. And I'm able to look at things from both sides without being just totally, well, I'm a Democrat, I can only see the bad things Republicans do, or I'm a Republican, I can only see the bad things Democrats do.
Yeah.
I'm able to see both sides and the I would say negative influences and the damage that both sides do to any particular group of people. But I know we're getting to the top of the hour, so I want to give you an opportunity to kind of how can we now take our lessons that we learned from those 9 elements. You talked about Trump as being like the poster child of the shadow, the negative shadow of U.S. history. How can we learn from that to kind of move forward? Let's see.
Yeah, so there's so many ways, and those we'll unpack those in future conversations. But the one thing I would suggest, which I think is, it could be the most powerful practice, simple practice, for anyone to do, and something I do on at least a weekly basis. I don't do it every day, but at least weekly, is a simple question that just ask, what might I be missing, or what might I not be seeing? In other words, staying curious and open to learning more. And that's what shadow really is. What's the thing that's hidden behind me, metaphorically speaking, that I'm not aware of yet that would help me be a more fully human being? So I would say just that. It's not about, the 45th president or the 46th or the 44th. It's not, we point to famous people to make examples, but it's really up to each of us to do our own work. And I think one of the most important practices among many prospective practices is just to ask that question and really inquire, what might I be missing? What might I not be seeing on this particular issue, or with my kid, or my significant other, or my boss, or my, whatever the context is. So I would say that's a great place to begin to recognize, own, and integrate one's own shadow.
Excellent. And even myself, I'm always asking, what could I have done differently in every situation?
Yeah.
What I haven't shared publicly, but I've shared privately, is the folks that I had a dog, and my dog attacked me, and I'm definitely still recovering because she attacked my hand very viciously, and the dog was put down. And what was interesting, I make this point real quick, is that when I share that with certain people, like even at the hospital emergency room, the gentleman was wrapping my hand. He was like, "It was your dog." So I got to ask you, what did you do? Right. That was his first thing. Like, that's not really typical dogs do that. So you must have done something to provoke that dog to do that. And of course, I'm in my emotions at that time. Like, well, the dog is still alive. You can go look at him. There's no, you get x-rays on him. There was no physical abuse. There's no history of him being hurt or anything like that to warrant what he did to me at all. Right.
Yeah.
But people will take the dog's side. And where I'm going with this is that I had to stop and really look at and say, okay, look at my history, because I had treated the situation differently. Now, I felt that because of the breed of the dog, being a pit bull, and they have that typical, they have a history of snapping. I believe that led to that. But also look at myself, to your point, which you just laid out. I don't just throw all the blame her. I said there could have been things I could have done differently that maybe it might not have been as severe, and it might not happen now. I think it would eventually happen at some degree. I just think that was in her nature. Yeah. But I definitely think there are some actions on my end I could have done differently to kind of prevent it, or definitely de-escalate it to the point where it didn't have to get where it needed to go. So I definitely take what you say to heart in that context. Because even in that, and I mentioned that situation, only point out that even going through something like that's traumatic to me, I still had to look at it and say, what could I have done differently? How can I behave differently in the future going forward? And not always it's never always the blame on someone else. And I think when you can begin to look at yourself critically in those situations, then that's where it's time and room for growth.
Yeah, beautiful. I mean, I appreciate your sharing that. Yeah, it is. I mean, that's you just learned a lot about the doctor or the healthcare professional. Just that was the first question. Well, what did you do, to cause this? And that's that's that kind of oversimplifying it, but that's that kind of blame culture. Something happened. Who should we blame? As opposed to, let's make sure you're all right. So yeah, I appreciate your sharing that piece of that story.
No, absolutely. And we've reached the top of the hour, so let's go with our examples of who we believe, past, current, present, of someone who is exemplifies the fully human characteristics that we're actually advocating.
Yeah, so I'm gonna just pull out of current events and a big picture. I'm gonna just say that I'm pointing to the January 6th committee, who took on a task that I think was really important and essential, and more specifically, the two Republican members, Liz Cheney and Adam Kitzinger, who unfortunately is not going to run for office again. He got so disillusioned by his experience in Congress, but both of whom were just really courageous and continue to take a lot of public criticism because they were seen as betraying their party. But the general comportment of that committee, and especially those two folks who put themselves at great political and in some ways personal risk by doing the work they did. So I'm just going to point to them, and Liz Cheney is not somebody that I agree with on anything policy wise, most things that I've prior to this committee, but I have a lot of respect for the role she played in it as well.
Well, I'm going to join you in that. I'm going to point out someone more specifically and say Senator Jamie Raskin.
Yeah.
And the interesting about Senator Jamie Raskin is I know him personally because he's from Tacoma Park, Maryland. Yeah. And he was a local in Maryland. He was a local senator here in Maryland, and he came out to Tacoma Park, and I knew him. And he is the only, and he's a Democrat, and he's to this day he's the only politician that I would say that I would go out and campaign for, door knock for, and really become an advocate for, because he's a person of true integrity. And not only is he brilliant in the context of his mind and being a constitutional attorney, but he's also a very fair man and has shown the fully human connections. I've seen him exhibit that within our own community. And then I knew his son. Okay. And for him to have to go through the ordeal right when his son committed suicide and still have to manage that trauma experience and still stand up for the nation and do what he did without it impacting his performance at all on that level, to me, is right in line with what I'm saying about somebody being fully human. He had every justification to kind of say, I'm going to pull myself back from this right now. This is just too much. I'd rather be with my family, my wife, and really just, grieve or deal with what we got to deal with. And you all deal with all this chaotic stuff. But he still stood up, stood strong. And that's the reason why he's the example of what I believe every elected official should be. So he's a person I definitely want to hold up as a fully human individual of mine on this particular day.
Yeah, beautiful. I was really deeply moved by his story right in 2021, after the insurrection and when he went public with what I didn't, he's not in my state, so I didn't know a lot about him. And I really have a lot of respect for him as well. So thanks for sharing that.
Absolutely. And again, we've gone over a little bit, but I think it was worth it. Definitely appreciate your investment time and energy again, Reggie, with doing the work you've done. You've been a great person to build with over the last 6 months. Like I said, we never knew each other prior to connecting and never met you in person. So one of these days we both hopefully get the honor to see each other in person, but it's just been a wonderful experience having this show with you, exploring these conversations. I look forward to it every week, and I hope the listening audience gets as much benefit from my conversations as much as I do. And hopefully they get your book, read your book, and hopefully it begins to plant that seed in people's minds that there's so much more we need to learn and grow about, not only other human beings, but more importantly ourselves, and then our actions and behaviors that we exemplify toward others. And hopefully that encourages everybody, particularly during this season right now. Look at how you can look at better ways to serve people and be of service to someone else. And that can help alleviate some of the stress and burden from you. So I just want to leave people with that today. And I want to wish everyone a wonderful holiday until our next show. And again, thank you again, Reggie, for your investment of time and energy.
Yeah, you're welcome, King, and thank you for hosting this and for these great conversations we have. At least they're great for you and me, right? We don't know. We hope other people appreciate them too, but we're having a good time.
It's growing. We see the reactions and the likes on LinkedIn and the comments. So it's continuing to grow. We still do our part and just continue to build it. So until next week, Reggie, have a great one. Listening audience, thank you all for listening to the Fully Human Connections podcast, and looking forward to everybody having a wonderful holiday season. Thank you.